The large glass doors of the Beacon newsroom swung open. A gentle breeze carried street dust across the worn stone steps. An elderly black man stepped inside, his clothes faded, frayed at the elbows. In his hand was an old tattered brown leather briefcase, its edges peeling, the strap hanging loose. The bustling newsroom fell silent for a moment as his raspy voice echoed through the space. 50 years ago, I wrote the biggest story of my life, but they buried it, and me with it. This paper owes part of its legacy to me. The silence stretched for a second, then shattered with mocking laughter. Young reporters turned to each other, bursting into chuckles. The laughter swelled, rippling through the room like a breaking wave. One shook their head, whispering, "This old man must be in the wrong place." He stood there, unmoving. The room's lively hum resumed after a few seconds of ridicule, but every now and then, eyes darted toward the strange man standing in the lobby. With each step he took, the wooden floor creaked, as if the past were returning, tapping a rhythm before breaking through a wall of silence that had stood for years. In a far corner, Lila Carter, a young reporter newly hired, stopped typing. She squinted at the man, as if trying to discern something unusual. His frame was thin but sturdy. His gaze was direct, fearless. A few editors whispered among themselves. An older one flipped through a notebook, trying to recall a name, but curiosity was quickly overshadowed by skepticism. A newsroom wasn't the place for wild claims in the middle of a workday. Then a large shadow loomed. Victor Hayes, a burly man in a crisp white shirt, stepped out of the security office. His face was stone cold, his eyes like lasers scanning the man from head to toe. Victor said nothing at first, just stood there for a long moment before approaching, slowly but with an imposing presence. Placing a hand on the stranger's shoulder, Victor leaned in, his voice low and cold as steel. "Get out now. This isn't the place for you." The air grew heavy. The old man didn't react. He simply turned to face Victor, meeting his gaze without a trace of fear. And then he spoke, his voice slow, as if each word had been weighed for half a century. "I am Malcolm Turner." The room fell silent. The air in the newsroom froze the moment the name was spoken. "I am Malcolm Turner." The elderly black man stood there, his gaze unwavering, his hand gripping the tattered brown briefcase tightly. In that instant, the clatter of keyboards stopped. A phone ceased ringing mid-tone. A young reporter raised an eyebrow, muttering, "Turner? That name sounds familiar." But then she shook her head. "No way. He'd have to be dead by now, right?" Another let out a faint chuckle. "What, does he think he's some kind of living legend?" Laughter broke out again, this time drier, as if everyone were trying to dispel the awkward tension pressing down on every breath. Victor Hayes tightened his grip on Malcolm's shoulder, his voice a low growl. "Listen, Turner or whoever you are, I don't care, but you're causing a disturbance. This newsroom isn't a museum." He glanced toward the door. "Walk out before I have to call the police." Malcolm didn't budge. He merely glanced at Victor's hand, then looked straight into his eyes, still calm. "You're touching me like I'm a criminal," he said, his voice not angry, just tinged with sadness. "But you're the one standing in the middle of a media crime that's lasted half a century." His words silenced the room. In the back, Lila Carter leaned forward, her eyes wide. She suddenly felt there was something more serious about this man. He wasn't a wandering lunatic. He knew exactly what he was saying. Clara Evans, the editor-in-chief who'd been in her role for less than a year, stepped out of her glass office. In her 30s, tall and sharp-eyed, she'd heard everything from the start, but had only now decided to speak. "You say you're Malcolm Turner?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "If that's true, can you prove it?" Malcolm nodded, his eyes never leaving Clara. "You're the editor-in-chief here, aren't you?" Clara didn't answer that question. She crossed the hallway, standing face to face with him, her gaze stern. "I'm the one responsible for keeping this newsroom from being dragged into a farce," she said. "And if you think the name Turner is a golden ticket to cause chaos, you're mistaken." Another reporter chimed in. "The Beacon belongs to the Harper family. Since when does a Malcolm Turner come into play?" Malcolm smiled, not with anger. "That's what I'm here to tell you all. But first, let me show you something undeniable. He placed the briefcase on the glass table in the center of the room. Dust rose in the harsh white light. Slowly, he unlatched it, pulling out a stack of old papers bound with red string, and set them down in front of Clara. Everyone held their breath. Clara leaned down to examine the yellowed stack of papers, each page etched with time through creases, folded corners, and faded ink. On the first page, a shaky handwritten line stood out. The Beacon, March 1975. Author, Malcolm Turner. The air in the room thickened. Victor Hayes stepped closer, frowning as he looked at the papers. Old papers don't mean the truth, he muttered. But Malcolm stood there, calm, his voice ringing clear, unwavering. I am Malcolm Turner. In 1975, I co-founded The Beacon with Charles Harper. Back then, we shared a vision: to use journalism to expose injustice, to give a voice to the voiceless. I wrote the first article, built the first column, printed the first issues with my own hands in a warehouse behind a small bookstore on Southridge Street. He paused, running a hand gently over the stack of manuscripts. But then, Charles betrayed me. He struck a deal with an investor, his wife's father, a wealthy white man. They pushed me out, told me to sign away my ownership for a settlement. I refused. The next day, my expose on a city government land scandal was pulled from the print run. My name vanished from the editorial board. And just a week later, I vanished. The room fell silent. A young reporter blurted out, "Why didn't you speak up?" "For 50 years, no one's seen you." Malcolm nodded, his gaze softening. "I was diagnosed with lymphoma. The doctors gave me 2 years to live. I had no family, no money, no identity. When the press and the authorities turned their backs, I chose to spend my final days in a minority community on the outskirts of Georgia, where no one cared who I'd once been." A beat of silence. "But I didn't die." He looked directly at Clara. "A miracle or a cruel twist of fate, I don't know. But I survived, and I kept living, in silence. I documented everything, every detail, every name, every meeting. I waited for the right moment, and today, I'm back." Victor shook his head, still skeptical. "No one can verify your story. Those pages could be fake." Malcolm didn't respond. He opened his briefcase again, pulling out an old photograph. 2 young men standing in front of a sign that read, "The Beacon, Truth is the Light." One was him, the other was Charles Harper. Clara took the photo, her palms growing cold. She murmured, "This can't be." Malcolm looked deep into her eyes, speaking slowly. "You have every right not to believe me, but don't let anyone stop you from seeking the truth." The meeting room felt so quiet it felt as if time itself had stretched to a suffocating stillness. Clara Evans still held the photograph in her hands, her eyes fixed on the words behind the 2 men. The Beacon, Truth is the Light. One of them was unmistakably a young Charles Harper. The other was Malcolm Turner. Victor Hayes narrowed his eyes, leaning in to scrutinize the photo, but then scoffed. "Photos can be faked. And those papers." Suddenly, a young man's voice cut in from the doorway. "If you need the original 1975 contract, notarized and sealed, I've brought it with me." Everyone turned their heads. A man in his late 20s stepped inside. Dressed in a simple shirt, he carried a waterproof briefcase, his brown hair neatly combed. He stood behind the old man, his gaze resolute yet polite. Clara squinted. "Who are you?" Malcolm smiled. "Let me introduce Marcus Reed. Not a lawyer, not a relative. He's the one who took care of me during my years in hiding in Georgia. But above all, he's the person I trust most." Marcus gave Clara a slight nod. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to bring the truth." Clara crossed her arms, her eyes never leaving the 2 men before her. "Fine. Let me ask you directly. If you're Malcolm Turner, the co-founder of The Beacon, why has no one in journalism ever mentioned you? Why do the founding records only list Charles Harper?" Malcolm looked at her for a long moment, then spoke in a low, steady voice. "Ms. Evans, how many black men were acknowledged in the legal records of 1970s New York when they had no lawyer, no family to protect them, No money to hire PR? Clara didn't answer. Her lips pressed into a thin line. A spark of doubt still flickered in her eyes, but curiosity had begun to creep in. Marcus stepped forward, handing her a large envelope. The original contract, notarized in 1975, it clearly lists 2 co-founders, and the clause was never revoked. Mr. Turner never signed any document relinquishing his ownership. Clara took it slowly, her eyes scanning the faded but legible ink. Victor frowned. "You're not seriously buying into this, are you?" Clara stayed silent, but her gaze had shifted. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not convinced yet, but I'll investigate thoroughly." Malcolm gave a slight nod, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips. Lila Carter stepped forward, standing beside Clara, looking at Marcus with curiosity. "Where did you come from?" she asked softly. Marcus turned to her, his tone gentle. "I didn't come from anywhere. I came to return a name that never should have been erased." Their eyes met for just a moment, long enough to plant a seed. Clara Evans sat in a small meeting room adjacent to the newsroom, the glass door slightly ajar. On the table lay the original contract Marcus had brought, its yellowed pages carefully tucked into a clear plastic sleeve. She flipped through each page, her eyes missing no detail. At the top of page 2, the name Malcolm Turner appeared, written in bold, steady handwriting, signed beneath the line, "Co-founder, The Beacon, 1975. Next to it was Charles Harper's signature. At the bottom, a red notary seal from the city office, dated March 4th, 1975. Clara said nothing, but Victor, leaning against the door with his arms crossed, kept shaking his head. "No way. If this is real, the entire legal system has been turning a blind eye for years?" Malcolm, still standing on the other side of the table, replied curtly, "Not turning a blind eye." They deliberately looked away. Victor took a step forward, his tone sharp. "What about the Department of Justice records? Trademarks? Assets? A newspaper can't run on a few sheets of paper." Marcus spoke calmly, his gaze fixed on Victor. Mr. Harper had power, money, connections. And what did Mr. Turner have besides his pen and a failing body? When he fell ill, every right was slowly stripped away. But this contract was never voided, never brought to court. Clara looked up, her voice hardening. "So you brought it here instead of taking it to court?" Marcus didn't flinch. "He doesn't need a lawsuit. He needs the truth printed on the front page of the very paper that betrayed him." Lila Carter, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward, her eyes locked on the contract as if it were a gateway to an untold past. She turned to Marcus. "So, all this time, you've been living with him?" Marcus gave a slight nod. "I met him at a small workshop in Georgia on local journalism history. No one in the room paid attention to him, except me. When I heard his story, I thought it was fiction. But every detail, every manuscript page, every journal entry he wrote, I couldn't ignore it." Lila looked at Marcus, her gaze softening. "And now you're here to rewrite a piece of history that was erased?" "No," Marcus replied. "I'm here to have it read by the man who wrote it." Clara stood up. She looked from Malcolm to Marcus, then to Lila. "I'll verify every legal mark on this contract. I'll call the city archives, cross-check the signatures, and trace every line of the paper's publishing history. If I find a single discrepancy," Malcolm nodded, "then print it on the front page." Clara gripped the documents tightly, walking out of the meeting room, leaving the three of them in a heavy silence. Victor watched her go, muttering, "She's starting to waver." The small meeting room now held only Malcolm, Marcus, and Lila. Outside, Clara was busy pulling archive files, while Victor stood guard in the hallway, unable to hide his restlessness. Marcus gently pushed a chair forward, inviting Malcolm to sit. The old man leaned on his cane, carefully lowering himself down. He took a slow breath, then looked up at Lila. "Have you ever believed in something so deeply you'd give your whole life for it?" he asked. Lila hesitated. "I think so. I used to believe journalism was about serving the truth." Malcolm nodded slightly, a faint, wistful smile on his lips. "In 1972, I met Charles Harper at a conference at Howard University. I was a freelance writer then, scraping by with articles for local papers. Charles was a recent communications graduate. We weren't alike. He was white, I was black. He had a family legacy, and I had eyes that always saw what others tried to hide. Malcolm's gaze drifted to the window, where the afternoon sunlight fell in streaks across the floor. We founded the Beacon in 1975. The name was my idea, a lighthouse for truth. I wrote the first investigative pieces on police brutality in Harlem, on land price manipulations that forced minority communities out of their homes. And Charles brought the license, the printing press, and the first investment from his father-in-law. His voice slowed, growing heavier. But when my expose on a major land deal involving Charles's father-in-law was set to publish, I saw his face change. He said, "Malcolm, we can't run a paper by committing suicide." A week later, the newsroom held a meeting. I was removed from my editorial role. A lawyer came with a contract asking me to sign away my rights for a payout. Guess what I did? Malcolm looked directly at Lila. Lila replied softly, "You refused." Malcolm gave a faint smile. I tore that contract apart right in front of them. The next day, I was ambushed on my way home. The police arrived nearly an hour late. No one was arrested, and the manuscript I'd submitted for print somehow disappeared from the system. Marcus sat in silence, his hands clasped. He's told me this story many times, but each time, it feels like the first. Malcolm turned to Lila, a gentle light in his eyes. "I'm not angry at Charles for betraying me. I'm angry because he betrayed the ideals we built together." Lila stayed quiet, her eyes welling up. "You wrote down everything during those years?" "Yes," he nodded. "Every night I wrote by hand. I remembered every word, every person involved. I didn't write for revenge. I wrote so that one day, someone who still believes in the truth might find it." Marcus spoke softly. "And now he's found those people." Malcolm looked at the two young souls before him, his gaze piercing through them. "I've lived long enough to know the truth doesn't win by speed, but by persistence." Clara sat upright in her private office, the contract still lying before her. The words, seals, and signatures danced in her mind. She'd called the city archives. The records checked out. The contract was real. The seal was real. And the Beacon had indeed once had two co-founders. Outside, the sound of arguing grew louder. Victor Hayes stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "Clara, are you turning this place into a circus? I've worked here for 27 years. I've never seen anyone dare challenge the Harper family." Clara looked up, her voice steady. "I'm not challenging anyone. I'm verifying a truth that's been hidden." Victor jabbed a finger toward the door. "That old man and the kid with him, they're causing trouble. And if you don't put a stop to this, I'll call the police right now." At that moment, the door swung open. Malcolm stood at the threshold, leaning on his cane, his voice calm. "Go ahead, Victor. Call the police and let them dig into the 1975 media ownership records. The fingerprints, the signatures, the notary logs." Victor stepped closer, his words hissed through gritted teeth. "You think a few rotting papers and the memories of an old man near his grave can shake this empire?" Malcolm didn't back down. "Not a few papers. The conscience of a man who's already dead." Clara froze. "What do you mean?" Malcolm turned to her, his gaze deep and still. "Charles Harper, 3 years before he died, sent his private lawyer a revised will. In it, he acknowledged me as the co-founder of the Beacon and expressed regret for his betrayal. He wanted to return my shares, but that will never be made public." Marcus nodded. "We have information from a retired legal clerk who worked in Harper's estate law office. He's willing to testify, if needed." Victor sneered. "Hearsay? Worthless." Clara clenched her fists. "If it's true, it's a bombshell." The air grew heavy. In the hallway, Lila was quietly recording the entire conversation. Her eyes met Marcus's as he stood beside Malcolm. When he stepped out of the room, she followed and whispered, "You really believe in him that much?" Marcus looked at her, his tone gentle. "I don't believe with my mind. I believe with time. 5 years living beside him, I've never heard a single word that didn't align with the truth. Lila gave a faint smile. I'm starting to believe too. Inside the office, Victor roared, I won't let the name Malcolm Turner reappear on any front page. If you dare publish anything about this, Clara, you'll lose everything. Clara met his gaze, her voice ice cold. I'd rather lose my job than be complicit in a lie that's lasted half a century. Clara stood alone in the meeting room, her eyes still fixed on the contract and Malcolm's testimony. She'd just received confirmation from the city's Department of Justice. The seal and signatures were authentic. And then an email arrived from an anonymous address, attached with a distorted audio file. A voice of an older man crackled through. I, Charles Harper, in full mental clarity, confirm that Malcolm Turner is the co-founder of the Beacon. I made the greatest mistake of my life. I want to return to him what should never have been taken. Clara sat frozen. Her hands trembled slightly. She glanced at the clock. 5:42 p.m. The newsroom was emptying out, but a few curious eyes still lingered on her office door. Rumors were spreading like ink in water. Victor was still pacing the hallway, surely waiting for her to back down and handle it internally. She opened the door and stepped out. Victor immediately lunged forward. What are you doing with those papers? Clara paused. I'm presenting them to the board, and if they refuse to act, I'll take them to another outlet. And if everyone stays silent, I'll post it online myself. Victor's jaw dropped. Have you lost your mind? The Harper family won't let you off. Then let them try, Clara said firmly. Behind her, Marcus and Lila were waiting. Marcus stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. You're not alone. Lila stood beside them, resolute. If you need someone to stand with you, I'll be the first to write the story. Not by order, but by conscience. Clara looked at them both, a glimmer of something long lost in her eyes. Hope. I need all the documents backed up. We can't trust the internal system. Marcus nodded. I've prepared everything. Digitized copies, scanned files, witness recordings, all encrypted and stored on 3 separate platforms. Clara exhaled as if a weight had lifted. Good. Tomorrow I'll meet with the board. But tonight, we rewrite history. Victor stepped back, stunned, watching the 3 of them stand in a united front, unyielding, fearless. He muttered, These kids don't know their place. Malcolm approached from a distance, his steps slow, but his eyes burning like a lamp reignited. He looked at Clara, speaking softly. The path you've chosen won't be easy, Clara, but if you see it through, it will lead you to the truth. Clara gave a slight nod. I don't want easy. I want to be right. The next morning, the atmosphere at the Beacon newsroom felt different. Sneaky glances, whispered messages, and eyes darting toward the editorial office where Clara, Lila, and Marcus were holding a private meeting with Malcolm. Clara placed the contract, the 1975 photograph, Charles Harper's recorded will, and the backed-up documents on the table. She took a deep breath. This is the moment we show the world what the Beacon truly stands for. Lila looked at her, nodding. Marcus placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. We're here. Clara opened the door and stepped out. Before her were dozens of waiting eyes. Editors, journalists, and designers who'd once followed orders, blindly now looked to her as a leader. She walked to the center of the large lobby, holding Malcolm's first manuscript. I have an announcement, she said loudly, and I don't want to just send an email. No one spoke. Clara raised her head. The document I'm holding is the first article of the Beacon from 1975. Its author was Malcolm Turner. Its founder was Malcolm Turner. The truth has been hidden for nearly half a century, and today we have the chance to bring it back. A beat of silence. Lila stepped forward, placing a printed copy of the article on the table in the middle of the room. I believe him, and I'm sorry on behalf of the generations that forgot your name. Then something no one expected happened. Ed, a veteran editor with 32 years at the paper, stepped forward, holding a stack of old documents. I saw the name Malcolm Turner in the internal archives once, but it was erased from the system in 1991. I kept a photocopy because it felt strange, Now I understand why. He placed the papers on the table beside the manuscript. Then another stepped forward, a female designer offering an original 1975 layout map, still listing M. Turner in the paper's introduction. One by one, others followed. Each person placed a piece of evidence, an apology, a memory on the table. Though small, they stacked into a mountain too solid to move. Victor stood in the far corner, his face pale. Malcolm looked at them, his voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd die in obscurity, but you've given me a different ending. Amid the emotional moment, Lila turned to Marcus, her voice soft as a breeze. Do you think, if he hadn't found you, what would have happened? Marcus looked at her, a gentle light in his eyes. Then I would have found him, one way or another. Lila smiled. And if I say, I don't just believe in him, but I'm starting to believe in us? Marcus looked at her, saying nothing, but the gentle squeeze of his hand was enough. A week later, public pressure reached its peak. Clara's article, titled The Forgotten Co-Founder, The Truth About Malcolm Turner and the Beacon, had been published across all official platforms of the newsroom. Within 48 hours, it became a social media phenomenon, with hundreds of thousands of shares and thousands of comments in support. TV stations, podcasts, major newspapers, all joined the fray. The public began chanting Malcolm Turner's name as a symbol of perseverance and justice. And finally, the Harper family could no longer stay silent. At a press conference held in the Beacon's main auditorium, all parties were present: the board of directors, staff, journalists from various outlets. Under the blinding glare of camera lights, the air was taut as a bowstring. A middle-aged woman stepped up to the podium. Margaret Harper, Charles Harper's only daughter, now the head of the investment fund that owned most of the paper's shares. Her eyes were weary, her voice trembling as she began. Our family was wrong. Wrong for many years. The room fell silent. Margaret bowed her head, tears brimming. My father, Charles Harper, before his passing, left a revised will acknowledging Malcolm Turner as the co-founder of the Beacon. That will was never made public for reasons we cannot justify. The sound of camera shutters clicked relentlessly. Margaret stepped back. Marcus took the podium, holding a copy of the will, his eyes bright but stern. I'd like to read an excerpt from Charles Harper's final testament. He opened the document, his voice steady and clear. I, Charles Harper, in my final days, acknowledge that Malcolm Turner co-founded the Beacon with me in 1975. Removing him from the paper was a betrayal of our original ideals. I wish for him to have his honor, shares, and name rightfully restored for his contributions. The auditorium fell silent. Some were already in tears. Malcolm sat in the front row, his head slightly bowed, hands gripping his cane tightly. When Marcus finished reading, he looked up. His eyes no longer burned as fiercely as they had the first day, but they were calmer, as if at last the half of his soul stolen for half a century had been returned. Margaret stepped back to the microphone. The Harper family officially recognizes Malcolm Turner as the co-founder of the Beacon. We will transfer the shares as per the will and proceed to amend all legal, media, and internal historical records of the newsroom. She bowed deeply. It was no longer a gesture of courtesy. It was a confession. Before the public and before the very soul of the paper her father had betrayed. Clara held Malcolm's hand tightly. Lila glanced at Marcus, her lips whispering soundlessly. We did it. Marcus gave a slight nod. We're only just beginning. A week after the groundbreaking press conference, a new plaque hung on the facade of the Beacon's headquarters. Founders, Malcolm Turner and Charles Harper, 1975. The bronze letters gleamed under the sunlight, like a wound finally stitched, leaving a scar but no longer painful. In the main editorial office, Malcolm sat in an old leather armchair. His hand gently traced the first page of a newly published book, The Light That Never Fades, a collection of the manuscripts he'd written over nearly 50 years of silence. On the cover, his name stood proudly beneath the words, Memoirs of a Forgotten Founder. Clara walked in, holding a steaming cup of tea. You didn't have to come in so early, she smiled. You're an official founder now. You've earned the right to be late. Malcolm chuckled softly, a serene light in his eyes. If I'm late, who'll check the spelling on your investigative pieces? They both laughed. Outside, Lila sat with Marcus on the rooftop balcony. A gentle breeze blew, tousling her hair. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her gaze drifting to the bustling city below. Do you think he'll really step back? Lila asked. Marcus shook his head, holding her hand. He might step back, but the fire he lit won't. And you'll be the one to carry it? She looked at him. Marcus paused for a moment, thoughtful. Not just me, it's us. It's Clara. It's everyone who writes for justice, not for shares. In the main meeting room, Malcolm stood, slowly walking toward the wall where portraits of the founders hung. An empty frame had been prepared. He stared at it for a long while, then turned to Clara, extending his hand. It's time for me to pass it on, he said. Pass it on? Clara asked, surprised. Malcolm nodded. You, Marcus, and Lila, you didn't just restore my honor. You proved that ethics aren't a relic of the past. They're the compass to move forward. He pulled an envelope with a sealed stamp from his briefcase, a deed transferring his founder's shares. On it, Marcus Reed's name was written in bold. He'll take my place, and he said. Marcus walked in at that moment, stunned. Are you sure? He asked softly. Malcolm looked straight into his eyes. The truth doesn't need a guardian. It needs a generation to carry it further. Clara, Lila, and Marcus fell silent, but in that silence was a vow unspoken. Malcolm Turner's story came to a close, but his legacy, his courage, his perseverance, and his faith in the truth would live on in every article, every word, every voice of resistance. For the light would never fade.